Good afternoon. I'm Doug Sesserman in my virtual office here in New York City during this coronavirus pandemic. And welcome to our Live from Israel webinar series, Ben-Gurion Briefings. Today we're going to have a discussion for 30 minutes. I'll introduce our scientist from Israel, Professor Victor Novack. He'll give a talk that I'll be moderating for about 20 minutes, and in the last 10 minutes of the discussion, we'll take questions from the audience. To ask a question, click on your Q&A button, and I'll be able to see the questions as they build. And toward the end of the discussion, I'll be using those questions from the Q&A to have a conversation with Victor. So Victor is one of the leading scientists in Israel studying medical marijuana and cannabis. He received both his MD and PhD from Ben-Gurion University, and he is the Gussie Krupp Professor of Medicine at BGU. He's also the head of internal medicine at Soroka University Medical Center across the street from the university. And he is the director of the Clinical Research Center and Research Authority, which is a collaboration between Soroka and Ben-Gurion University. He also leads the BGU Soroka Cannabis Research Institute, and he teaches at both of Ben-Gurion University's medical schools. Our Joyce and Irving Goldman Medical School taught in Hebrew, and the Medical School for International Health that is taught in English. Victor specializes in evidence-based research on the efficacy of medical cannabis for pain management, dementia, juvenile autism, personalized medicine, and the impact of air pollution on health. Prior to his current position, Professor Novack served as the medical director at the Harvard Clinical Research Institute in Boston, where he contributed to the design of more than 40 feasibility and pivotal trials for medical devices. Professor Novack did his postdoctoral work at Harvard, and he's originally from Moscow, where he made Aliyah to Israel at the age of 20. Welcome, Victor.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you so much for having me here.
Let's start with just a broad question, and then I want you to explain your audience your research. But let's start with just what's the difference between medical marijuana and cannabis, the difference between marijuana and cannabis.
Right, so, gosh, I wish I would know that, but the point is that it's a relatively new field, or let's say it's a new field in terms of the research and use by, say, the official medical establishment. And as such, as any new science, it has some problems with the definitions. So you would ask many people, and many people will give different answers. There is no universal nomenclature, and actually this is one of the problems of the field, because when I say medical cannabis, people can understand something different from what I would use as a medical cannabis. But I think with
people tend to use the words interchangeably, right? They'll say right. Marijuana, and some will say cannabis. My understanding is that cannabis and marijuana and hemp, these are all plants, and that marijuana is a part of the species of the cannabis plant, as is hemp.
Yeah, well, that's true. But again, it's if you look in the medical literature in this field, it almost used interchangeable. And again, as previously mentioned, there is a problem of definitions. And sometimes when we read a paper or somebody is reporting on the use of medical cannabis, his definition of medical cannabis may be very different from our definition. For example, the source of the material can be a natural source from the plant. It can be a synthetic source, and so on and so forth. So the point is that it is always useful to ask, when you read something, what is the source of the material, and what are the ingredients that were used during this clinical activity? Is it the whole plant? Is it some components? How was it assessed? And so on and so forth.
So let's start with Israel and medical cannabis research. Medical cannabis and marijuana has been used in Israel really since the 1990s, one of the leaders in the world in terms of the use of medical marijuana. And I believe some of the early research dates back to the 1960s. Tell us about the work that you do in researching the effects of medical cannabis.
Sure. So maybe as a practicing physician, I would rather start from the notion that cannabis is not helpful in corona. So that's probably not true. And even though it is kind of planned to be studied right now, but folks do not use it to treat corona if you have it. There is a standing recommendation by the different societies in the United States that actually the smoking is one of the risk factors for serious infection. So smoking should be forbidden entirely, even if it is smoking of the cannabis products. But back to the history of the research. So as you maybe know, the pioneer of the cannabis research was actually Professor Meshulam, with whom I have a pleasure to work on some of our research programs. He is from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and he was the one who actually discovered the endocannabinoid system in our body and discovered some of the components of the plant. His research was primarily basic type or translational type of research, even though at some point his group crossed into the clinical research. Starting about, I would say 7 years ago, Israel started slowly accumulating the data on the clinical use of cannabis, and that's actually where we work. We work on the level from the developed compounds toward clinical implementation of the cannabis. And so, as always with the evidence-based medicine, your first goal in developing this evidence, it is to actually establish the safety profile of whatever you plan to use. And that is was and is our primary goal, even before we go into the efficacy studies. So you slowly, in Israel here, we started accumulating the data, and it went a rather unusual way. And this is maybe one of the things that separates cannabis from other medication. Usually, when folks develop now a medication, that usually starts from clinical trial and then goes into the real world experience, and then you have some observational studies. With cannabis, it went the opposite way. So we started from observational studies. Basically, people started using cannabis for different diseases and conditions. And we started slowly accumulating this data, trying to separate the true effect from something that is just a belief. And we are slowly now progressing toward clinical trials. So the way that we develop this is completely opposite to the usual pharma way of dealing with the new compounds.
Just had to unmute myself for a second. So in your research, you've studied the effect of cannabis on a number of pain areas, helping for relief from pain. Could you just speak to some of the types of disorders or problems where cannabis has proven to be effective? Cancer patients, fibromyalgia, juvenile autism, seizure disorder, Parkinson's, even used by the IDF with PTSD and others, Crohn's disease. Just comment on some of the areas where you've seen cannabis to have a positive effect.
Sure. So I would rather start from the sort of general approach-based question. So when you look at cannabis, right, and let's for a second compare this to opioids. Both compounds are well known to the humanity for the last 5,000 years, right? Both compounds are completely natural compounds. They're coming from the plants. Both compounds have an internal body-based system with the receptors. So we have similar compounds in our body occurring naturally, both compounds are highly effective or effective in treating pain. And yet, with one compound, opioids, we, as conventional medical doctors, know how to use it, or in the case of maybe United States, also how to abuse it. But cannabis kind of stayed away from the list of the medications that we, as a medical doctors, are using for the last 80 years at least. So, but yet, if you look on the cannabis as a plant, you would expect, again, based on the characteristics and the historical knowledge that we have, that the pain-based symptoms would be probably the main condition or main disease where you can treat your patient with cannabis. So we, in our research, we started looking through the evidence starting from this particular point. So in the first research that we did, we basically took almost 5,000 patients who were using cannabis for different symptoms and look what is actually the main reason that they were using cannabis. And apparently 70% of the cannabis users here in Israel are using this because of cancer or cancer-related symptoms, pain, nausea, this insomnia, and so on and so forth. So this percentage is very high, because if you compare this to the usual cannabis user in the United States or even in Europe, our patient is much, much sicker. They're at average 60 years old. As I already mentioned, 70% of them have active cancer, as compared to less than 15% in American or European cohorts. And these people have at average 4 comorbidities, like diabetes or hypertension or heart disease, and so on and so forth. So those are really, really sick people. In Israel, one of the advantages of our system was that we don't have recreational cannabis, and it was actually at the beginning, and even now, it's quite challenging to get the permission to use medical cannabis, which allowed us.
My understanding in Israel is that medical marijuana is legal, but recreational marijuana is still illegal, although decriminalized.
That's completely true. And that it stays this way for the last 10 years. And it allows us basically to look into the sort of people with the real diseases. I already mentioned 70% with cancer. So we looked at this huge cohort of almost 5,000 patients to see what is the safety profile of cannabis. And what we discovered in our first look was that it's a remarkably safe medication. So less than 5% of the population using cannabis. And again, we're looking not about young people. This is the population with the average age of 60. So less than 5% had any side effect that was severe enough to stop using cannabis. And again, if you compare this to any imaginable medication out there, 5%, it's a low number. So that was very reassuring.
Victor, I promised I was going to hold the audience's questions till the end, but I just got one in that's very interesting and related to what we're talking about. Lori Dinnerstein Curse asks, she says that about 30 years ago, pot was very helpful in alleviating the excruciating pain from her MS. Is the pot from 30 years ago the same product you're talking about now?
Well, I would say no, because without going into the nitty-gritty of cannabis plant, right now the THC concentration of the plant, first of all, it can be regulated, but it can be as high as 20%. Pot probably 20 years ago had 1 to 2% of THC, so now it's a very potent compound.
THC is the hallucinogenic aspect of the cannabinoid versus the CBD, which is non-hallucinogenic, but also might be helpful for alleviating pain.
That's correct. We think that the current thinking is that THC is primarily responsible for the pain, for treating the pain syndromes. But maybe we are just kind of jumping forward, it is that one of the main things that again separates cannabis from the usual medication you have out there, it is that for my, say, cardiac patient, I can tell him like you should be on aspirin or baby aspirin, 100 milligrams a day, and forget about that. That's his dose to the end of his days. With cannabis, it doesn't work like that. For a slew of the reasons. One of them it is that you have to titrate it. So the therapeutic dosage of cannabis can be such that it will take you time to get to it. Because if you start immediately from, say, 10 milligrams of THC a day, which is pretty high dose, you probably will feel very, very sick and dizzy, and you basically will spend your days with nausea and vomiting rather than being treated for your symptoms. So you have to titrate it individually. And based on you, I can say what would be the sort of end dosage at the end of the titration process that can take a few months. Where will you be? And this is one of the disadvantages of the cannabis, because it's very difficult to explain to the usual medical doctor that you have to titrate this in such a wide range. People can be treated with the same disease, same symptoms by 5 milligrams of THC a day, or they can go as high as 100 or maybe 200 milligrams a day. And for now, we don't have good prediction rules to see where they will end up. So back to the question that was asked there, even if the plant is more potent, it takes a time and patience to titrate our patients with the compounds.
So getting back to the use of cannabis as an alternative to opioids for pain management,
Yeah.
what has your research shown?
Right, so that's probably the most promising direction for the research. We believe, and again, at that point, I would use the word believe, that it can actually help treat patients who have, say, combination of two symptoms. One of them would be chronic pain, and the other would be opioid dependence. Again, there are not much data out there in terms of the evidence-based, and it's very difficult to run these studies due, again, to the several reasons. One of them is very prosaic. It's money. Clinical trials, it's a very expensive business. You have to invest in this many $100,000, if not $1 million. And right now, I would say the large companies, large producers are not there. They do not support research to the extent that, say, the usual pharma companies would support the usual pharma product research. And again, there are many reasons. There are more economical than I would say humanity oriented. But the point is that there are not much of research out there, and the fact that federal government still treats cannabis as THC, at least Schedule 1 compound, actually prohibits application for federal grants. And for many universities, including one of them where I work in Harvard, it's always a question, would you apply to federal grants? And there are federal grants for studying the marijuana, medical cannabis, but then it would be somehow staying on your reputation, and maybe you will have problem with the different other grants. And this is always a dilemma for American scientists, and that's actually one of the reasons why we do some of the research here in Israel.
Right. So in the U.S., recreational and medical use is illegal at a federal level, but some states it's legal both recreational or medical, and many there is medical. I'm from Colorado before I moved to New York City, and I know that the state of Colorado, through some of its marijuana sales, helps to support research for cannabis for medical purposes. Israel's unique in that it's one of the only countries in the world where government funding is actually supporting some of your research. Is that correct?
To a certain extent. Again, without going into the details, how much does it cost? But that's true. We have some granting systems that allows us to run small trials. But here is the thing, that in Israel, we don't have, for example, abuse of opioids to that extent that you guys have in United States, due to the sort of well-known reasons and well-known history of prescription medications. But just going back into the question that you asked me about the research. So when we discovered that actually it is safe, we then looked at the data specifically on the population of patients older than age of 65, just an elderly cohort, because we figured out that if you treat, if you want to treat such a diseases as Parkinson or cancer, it is by definition diseases of, say, more advanced age. So it doesn't make any sense to look on the efficacy and safety of your medication in young people, because they don't have these diseases in general, right? So we looked specifically into the population of elderly, a cohort almost of 3,000 subjects older than 65. And again, we look into the safety of the medication, and we were pleasantly surprised by the same facts that minority of them, again, less than 5%, had symptoms that forced them to stop the medication. People were really compliant on medication and really continuing to use it after, say, 6 months. It was really a very sick population, because within the first 6 months, almost a third of our population, unfortunately, died because of underlying diseases. So those are not young folks who are looking for sort of way to get some high from cannabis. It's a real deal. And we looked actually on their pain symptoms, and the level of pain decrease was really surprising. In general, at the beginning of the treatment, the average pain level was 8 on the scale from 0 to 10. And at the end of the treatment, or at the beginning of the sort of steady state, after 6 months, the pain level for those who survived went down to 4. So it was really an effective medication. Again, it is under the caveat that it wasn't a randomized controlled trial, and some or part of this effect is due to the placebo effect. And again, as a scientist, as a physician, I shouldn't forget about this being a part of the equation, requiring doing a randomized controlled trial or even blinded controlled trial with all the difficulties involved.
I'm getting a question about someone that uses opioids for pain management, that they don't feel well, they feel groggy when they take the opioids. When in your studies, do you find that patients that are utilizing medical cannabis feel better, don't have the same negative side effects?
So that was actually another one of our studies. We looked specifically on 800 patients who started the cannabis treatment while being treated with opioids for chronic pain. And again, it's a large cohort. This study was done together with one of my PhD students, Lee Barlev, who is a medical director at one of the companies producing medical cannabis. So she looked into the population of 800 subjects with chronic opioids use. And what we discovered that that about 40% of opioids users at the end of the 6 months either stopped using opioids or went down with the daily dosage of opioids. Again, under the caveat that it is not a randomized controlled trial, but still the effect is to such extent that it would certainly at least give us a hope that this can be a strategy, a way out for many of the patients who have this double hit of chronic pain and opioid use. And at this point, I would go into the sort of and a bit of explanation. As you know, there is now this big backlash by the American medical establishment against using the prescribed opioids, and it's frequently is leaving the patients without any pain medications right now. So, okay, you stop opioids after 10 years. So what now? You still can have a pain. And that is very difficult to deal with it because the machine is working as a machine. As previously, machine worked to produce more and more opioids. Right now, there is an order to stop it. So what do you do with your patient? And I think this is something that should be thoroughly researched. And I would love to see a big, large, randomized clinical trial looking specifically into this problem of chronic opioids use together with the chronic pain.
Victor, I'm getting some questions about how in your trials, how is the cannabis actually ingested? Do people smoke it? Is it in some form of an edible, a tincture, etc.?
Yeah. So in Israel, if you look into Israel landscape in this way, so in Israel we have now about 60,000 people with the license to use medical cannabis. Majority of them are already not smokers, so less than 40% are just smoking the plant. The rest are using this in a way of oil, drops, or even some capsules. So we are currently using in some of our studies a mix of the approaches. And again, we, as a medical doctor, I'm very, very against smoking no matter what, because it has a damaging effect on an epithelial of your respiratory tract. So we're trying to push the companies basically to switch into the oil and capsules. However, there is a problem, and one of the problems or unsolved problems with the medical cannabis, it is a delivery method. And it means that each delivery method requires a calibration, because the release of the medication into the bloodstream is, especially medical cannabis, it is just one-to-one dependent on the way of the delivery. And for example, you get a very high level and almost an immediate effect if you smoke something. When you ingest something, it is a delayed effect, and so on and so forth. And so one of the sort of fields where Israel is very active, or Israeli companies are active, they are actually working into the field of the delivery systems, how to standardize the delivery, and moreover, how to standardize the levels, the blood levels of the medication. So in some of our studies, we're using a mix. In some of our studies, we're pushing only for ingestible medication.
Okay, I've got a couple of, I'm reminding the participants, if you have a question, just go into the Q&A function. You can ask a question of Professor Novack. I've got a couple of really good ones I want to try to send your way. So one is from Andrea Gorin. Andrea, thank you for joining us and asking this question. He's asking, have you heard of Rick Simpson oil? He has a friend whose father had some beneficial treatment related to prostate cancer. And just, he wants to know if you've heard of the oil and any other similar results it may have had for prostate cancer or others, and how that might be related to your work.
Right. I should be very, very open about that. Of course, we heard about the Rick Simpson oil, but as for now, we don't have a good evidence that cannabis actually treats any cancer. So there is a very small intermediate level trial done in a brain tumors, showing that there was a beneficial effect. However, there are also some basic science works showing that actually some of the cannabis ingredients can promote the growing of the tumors. So I would say that this is the area that there is no evidence as of for now for any effect. And so we are more focused on treating the symptoms rather than the malady itself. So there are some research programs going on now, both in States and Europe and also in Israel, but I'm yet to be aware of any definitive results of treating any cancer with any cannabis-related product.
So what you've seen is some positive effects dealing with alleviation of symptoms as opposed to curing the underlying problem.
That is very, very correct. And you know,
we're getting a question, Victor, on autism. Can you just speak to your work with autism patients?
Sure. So this was work done together with Gal Meiri, who is one of the leaders of BGU Center for Autism Research. He also is a treating physician at Soroka. So we looked in the cohort, which was a large cohort of almost 200 kids with autism symptoms who were treated with cannabis. And we did pretty extensive questionnaire on them and looked into their behavior over the period of 6 months. And again, we saw pretty much very beneficial effect with the little safety concerns that I would explain a bit later. But in terms of what's happening with them, the sort of general notion out there, it doesn't treat autism. Again, it treats the symptoms, and the kids became more engaged. They are less aggressive, which always a good news for kids with autism, and it allows for a better communication with them. Their sleep is much better, appetite is much better, and so all in all, parents are really sticking to that. Again, we should be careful about that because in parallel there is another great study published by Israeli group from Hebrew University, where they did a randomized research showing again a great benefit of cannabis treatment with autism, but there are side effects. Some of the kids who are prone to develop psychotic events actually do develop psychotic events, and that's something that anybody who treats kids with autism, and again, I'm only a researcher in this field. I don't treat kids. I'm internal medicine. People who treat kids with autism should be aware of that. And again, I'm going back to the titration process. It is very important because I cannot, even based on our research, I cannot tell you that there is one dose that fits everybody. It's basically a long process, and somebody already asked this question. It takes approximately 3 months to get to steady state, and you have to be always sort of in control, working out any potential side effects versus the positive effects. And side effects can be plenty. Again, I'm going back to our elderly study. For example, one of the questions that we would ask, like, what happens with the elderly? Because that's not very useful if just everybody goes to bed and just sleeps there. Well, it's true, you're without pain, but you're completely groggy. So the level of daily activities is something that we're looking for. And another PhD student of mine, Ran Abu Hatsira, he went and did a research specifically working out what is the level of daily activities in the elderly taking cannabis. And we, again, were pleasantly surprised that even if you're treating your patient with a psychoactive medication like THC, the level of daily activities doesn't go down. So that's a very good actually finding, because again, if somebody from the audience worked in the hospital, worked with the elderly, you know that there is a phenomenon of delirium. It's sometimes, especially in the hospitals, elderly folks experiencing some acute psychosis, some acute delirium, and they are completely disorganized and they don't sleep. And there is even a name for this phenomenon. It's called sundowning syndrome. Sun goes down and everybody goes bananas in the department. So our usual way to treat these folks would be basically either to tie them with a rope to the bed, which is not a pleasant experience to anybody, including the physicians. For example, in my department, I strongly sort of forbid this type of treatment of the patients, but you can understand that in Israel, for example, where we're not staffed as an American in terms of nurse to patient ratio, you have to deal with these patients at night because they're prone to falls and they're prone to injuring themselves. So sometimes we use a very strong psychotropic medications, but that's the same. You're basically tying this patient with the Halidol or similar medications to the bed.
So Victor, we had called this webinar for 30 minutes. We're at 35 minutes, but however, I'm going to pull the executive order of the moderator, and we're going to go for another 10 minutes because your audience keeps building. We have over 120 people still participating, and you have the highest ratio of questions per participant of any webinar we've hosted. We still have 23 questions in the queue. So I'm going to do my
Sure.
best
I
in
will
these
be
last
short.
10
I will be
minutes.
short. I promise you.
I'll do my best in the last 10 minutes to ask some of these questions. Ernie Simon's asking you just to comment a little bit on treatment of delusional disorder with cannabis.
So again, probably psychotic type disorders are not good candidates for now for treatment with cannabis. Again, there is this controversy out there: should patients with schizophrenia be treated with cannabis or not? There is not much of a good evidence. But again, I'm going back to my previous rant about elderly patients. Those patients with acute delirium, we do have an evidence that that's actually a very good medication to calm them down and give them a good sleep and basically get them to normal instead of basically drugging them or tying them with a rope to the bed.
I'm getting a question from Kara Bortman. Kara, thank you for asking this question. She's trying to help her mom who has MS, but her mom's got concern about feeling high. She's asking, where does she learn more about the balance between CBD and THC in treating something so people have the pain benefit, but don't feel bad or off because of taking it?
Right. So MS is an interesting problem. So here we have, I would say, less of a good news. The largest ever done clinical trial, randomized clinical trial in any field with cannabis was actually done in MS, and it was a negative trial. However, there was another trial that showed that there is some benefit in patient-reported spasticity symptoms. So to the question of the pain control versus high, I think the key answer it is actually in titration process. So you have to titrate the medication starting low, and again there are different regimens. You can read of on some of them in our publications where we describe in details how you do that. But the general advice it is that you go by the symptoms and by the feeling of the patient, because unfortunately there is no one answer that fits everybody. Somebody can go as high as 100 milligrams of THC daily without any whatsoever feeling high, and others would be completely groggy at 5 milligrams of THC.
I'm getting a really good question from Gary Berman. He says he lives in Maryland, which has medical cannabis. A doctor approves you to go get a license, but is not involved in picking the proper product or the dosing. You end up going into a dispensary where there are a bunch of former hippies that try to help you. He's asking, how do you suggest somebody navigate to actually get the right product and dosage level?
Yeah, that's exactly the problem that I was referring to. Unfortunately, the kind of cannabis establishment in the United States, it's more chiseled toward, I would say, a recreational, semi-medical use of this. And so you have actually to find somebody who will be willing to titrate this, like doing this by yourself, you can try, but it can be very, very challenging and very difficult. You have to be patient with that. And basically, again, doing this up titration very, very slow. Find the good doctor who would be willing and who had an experience of titrating these patients, or come to Israel. We can do that here.
I'm getting a question from one of my colleagues from the Canadian operation. By the way, we have participants from Israel, Canada, and the US all joining us in this webinar. David Burson asks, where does BGU stand out compared to other Israeli universities in terms of its cannabis research? Is your research the same or unique in some ways? And are there specific projects that people could help support?
Right. So in BGU, we have maybe 3 to 4 basic science researchers who are doing different type of research in terms of the basic mechanism and different preclinical stages. And we are running more of a clinical program. again, there are many other good places doing research, and I think that without bragging, if you need to put a sort of one field that we are probably more advanced than others, it wouldn't certainly not be our PR, because we are not BGU, but Soroka side. We are not that good in this one in promoting our research. But right now, I think that we are doing that. But we are more advanced in terms of how you actually treat your actual patient. And this is a question for me and for many of my physician colleagues. How do you treat the patient in front of you? Not saying that I will treat any imaginable cancer, not say that we treat any imaginable malady out there, but actually, what is the steps tomorrow? How do you help your patient with the cancer? How do you help your patient with fibromyalgia, with opioid dependency, and so on and so forth? So clinical research is something that we are probably more, I would say, advanced than others at this point of time.
So we're getting a question from Ronnie Strongen, and since Ronnie and her team, along with Melody, helped put on this webinar, I think she should get to ask her question. She's asking and had the understanding that your research had shown that CBD without THC doesn't work. Can you help clarify the benefits of CBD by itself or with THC?
Right. So I would put it this way, mildly. So there are, of course, research programs showing that CBD alone is working. For example, as you know, the CBD alone is one of the medication approved by FDA, by agency, to treat two rare types of childhood epilepsy. But what we see in our population is that low THC regimens are not that useful in terms of the pain treatment, nausea treatment, insomnia. And not by chance I'm always mentioning these three symptoms, but because those three symptoms, also by this great report by American Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, was shown that these three things at least have some initial evidence that cannabis might help. All the rest, it's very anecdotal evidence, and we can't really, as proponents of evidence-based medicine, recommend them. However, again, I'm going back that there is one medication approved, and this medication is entirely, purely CBD. But I wouldn't treat somebody with a pain or nausea or insomnia with pure CBD products. I think that would be probably less effective.
We're getting a question from Margaret Woodbury. She's asking if you could address the risk of brain gray matter shrinking in the frontal cortex.
Yes. So there was this report about the cannabis teenage users and the effect on your brain activity. Again, I would cautiously say that this is not probably the best research out there to be presented. However, we have always to be on the side of be cautious in our approach to treating our patients. And as you remember, primum non nocere, that's an underlying saying that basically dictates our daily activities as a medical professionals. First, do not harm. And so I would say that probably wouldn't be a great idea to treat your teens with cannabis. But it is always sort of a balance, because if your teen has, for example, a severe form of autism, it might be something that you would consider to treat with cannabis, knowing that it might be that it has some detrimental effects. And again, as a medical professional, I always remember that any of my medications has two sides. Anything that I give to my patients has a potential amount of harm. Even your baby aspirin can kill you instantly. So it's always a balance of two sides. Doug, you disappeared right now. Okay, I don't know if you guys can hear me. I will continue, but let's see if something changes. But there was one question about treating arthritis pain. Again, in terms of the pain symptoms, that is a sort of a great direction that some of us are doing research right now in arthritis. Again, you must remember that it probably doesn't treat arthritis per se, or at least there is no evidence that it treats arthritis. However, it does alleviate pain. I would say that local application probably is not effective because the amount of the active medication going into your bloodstream is extremely low. So I would not recommend the use of the local topical medications, at least for now, where there is no good evidence for that. There is another question here that asked about Israeli company that developed an inhaler with an accurate measured dose. Indeed, there is an Israeli company that developed an inhaler that is currently in an investigation, and actually you can already, I think, even purchase it, that can measure what you inhale, and that can potentially help you with a titration process. Okay, so I believe that Doug is back. Okay, there is a question about fibromyalgia. Hello?
Okay, yes, so it seems that Doug lost his internet connection. So Victor, why don't you answer this final question and then we'll call it a wrap for today.
So maybe, yeah, let's wrap it. So I would say the following. So we have published quite a lot the topic. I urge you guys to read with cautious anything that you read about cannabis. It's not one drug that will treat everything, but there are certain symptoms that we can safely say for now that they are treatable with the cannabis medications and which has a very good safety profile. So, and that's, I would actually end this presentation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Okay. Thank you, Victor, so much for taking the time to speak with us. And thank you to everybody who has joined us this afternoon. Be on the lookout. Our next webinar is April 29th, where we're going to talk about Jewish humor. So be on the lookout and please register for that webinar. And thank you so much, Victor, and everyone. Have a great rest of the day. Thank you. Be safe.
Thank you so much.